Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. So yes, there's a bit of a split there to address to begin with. So I work in research administration, but I have a previous life as a lecturer in film, and this is where a lot of this comes from. However, it turns out research administration is a slightly more reliable paycheck. So with this presentation, effectively, I'm continuing a tradition I've seen from other presentations yesterday and today, in that I have a theoretical framework that's currently a bit more conceptual, that I'm testing against different ideas, different properties, different genres, and the opportunity to test it against the Warhammer 40k IP was not something I could resist, really, for reasons I'll go into. So does this want to? There we go. So it's in terms of a 20-minute presentation today, as ever, it will be slightly ambitious and there may be some very fast talking at times, but we'll see how we get there. So I'm just going to very briefly introduce the framework that I've been working with and I've been sort of publishing papers on, and then I'm going to talk about how that goes against the context of 40k, what you can do with it, what you struggle to do with it, what you can't do with it. And also going to talk about the commercial context. So where we've just been talking about maturation, we've just been talking about changing things potentially for that commercial context. That's also going to come up in today's presentation. But the thing is, when I was presenting this, I just couldn't get this thing from The Wire out of my head. And it's very simple. I'm not going to read out the whole quote, but at one point there's three narcotics detectives in an office and they're talking, and one of them says, "Oh yeah, we're fighting the war on drugs, one brutality case at a time." And someone else says, "You can't call it a war, wars end." And that's kind of stuck with me, really, because the framework I'm using, conceptually, it starts out with finding a way to approach stories from a structuralist theory. And I've ended up going back to what I feel is a very cut and dry but very useful framework put forward by Shelton. And the idea is here that there is a very concrete set of minimal elements for a minimal complete plot, the things that you need for a minimal complete plot. And as most people will know, there are hundreds of textbooks on script writing and screenwriting that will come up with 5, 7, 9, 13 step plots. But at the base of this, I kind of travel back to Todorov, who says that we start with a state of one equilibrium, which he labels similar equilibrium. There's a process of degeneration that leads to a state of imbalance, and a process of improvement that leads to a state of different equilibrium. Not necessarily better or worse, simply different. So narrative starts, something imbalances the state of play in that narrative, and actions are taken that then move us towards a different equilibrium state. And that's the minimal components. The problem with this assumption is that Hill identified it has the requirement of an idea of a narrative solution, that there will be some way to solve the events. The transition to different equilibrium must have some inherent problem that can be overcome and that can be resolved. And that's a problem with 40k, as I'm hoping to talk about today. There's also this other element of refining this framework, because when we have that cut and dry structuralist framework, it's great because you can, in a very naming of parts way, identify stories and how they progress. But the way I've been working with looking at that is looking at how morality impacts on narrative satisfaction. And as we mentioned in the introduction, effectively there's something very satisfying about wanting to see people get what they deserve. It's something that's baked into human nature. It's something that we've abstracted in mythology as deified abstractions, of gods and goddesses, of the things about being human, as opposed to lightning, nature. So I've kind of explored this previously. It's relatively simple in Westerns. The bad man in the black hat comes to town and does something morally outrageous that the good man in the white hat has to come in and step in and sort out. So same with the James Bond films. The villain has a plan that will lead to death, destruction, mayhem, and murder for their own personal gain. And Bond steps in and sets things right. And we have that satisfaction from seeing that hubris punished. Gladiator also is kind of the fullest extent of that, where we have a son who murders his father, which is hubristic enough, but he's also murdering his father to assume the emperorship. And so that has to be punished within a moral framework that we're used to. Gets a bit trickier with things like Sicario because you have politics involved. Gets a bit trickier when you look at things like horror films and cult horror films because you have an externalized agential force that comes in there to impact on that. But when it comes to 40k, there's a lot of opportunities. So the ones I've been able to identify are this idea of legacy, because we have these origins back in 1987 and even further, depending how far we want to take it pre that era. You have this macro scale, you have the galaxy spanning stories, and you have a 10 millennia, not sure if I'm using that quite correctly, split. But you also have the micro scale. You have these individual stories, these individual triumphs, these individual tragedies. We've also had the word transmedia mentioned already today, and I believe, Asa, you were mentioning that in terms of research. And that's fascinating because the more transmedia elements you introduce, the more rigid canon control has to become if you want to maintain that strict emphasis on canonicity. You have context, because you have the canon context, you have this narrative that's continuing, but you also have a commercial context because the books wouldn't exist without the models, arguably. And then you have genre, and genre is where this analysis can come in quite comfortably. We can look at it as science fiction, we can look at it as military thrillers, we can look at it as cosmic horror. We can also find examples of children's fiction in the Warhammer universe, and romance fiction in the Warhammer universe, and coffee table books of the type that Taschen and Dorling Kindersley do. But the problem I found is the scaling issue. Complexity increases as the scale moves. So, as I was saying, Chris, earlier, I'm not going to be able to give such a lovely summary of this text as you, but from a structuralist point of view, if we take a single story like Lion, Son of the Forest, Lionel Johnson wakes in a strange place after a long slumber. He discovers enemies and gathers forces in a period of imbalance because he's awoken in a period of imbalance and actions have been taken to precipitate it. And then he defeats these foes, he establishes a new equilibrium, and he learns that one of his brothers is alive at the close of the novel. And that last point is arguably key to the next step, because that's a little nod. It's something that Chris Wright, in his annotations for Lords of Silence, talked about how if they happen naturally, it reinforces the coherency of the mythos. If you do them too often, then you're creating something that the reader is forced to engage with rather than can engage with and say, okay, that's interesting. So, single story level, this framework is quite comfortable for obvious reasons. So in structuralist terms, every story has a beginning and a middle and end, just not necessarily in that order. You can look at this framework, you can utilize this framework in terms of formulae. And there are some formulae within the 40k universe. Caiaphas Cain, whose name I perpetually worry about pronouncing correctly, is one of those that I would highlight here because there's a set formula. And this becomes obvious because it's been published in omnibus formats. So, if you're reading the individual books as they came out several years apart, you'd notice it several years apart. At the moment, if you get the omnibus editions, which are free, sometimes free and a bit books put together, you notice the formula relatively quickly. But Cain attempts to avoid a dangerous posting or situation, but in doing so, he becomes embroiled in something even more dangerous. That's his period of imbalance. He survives, and despite his best efforts, he appears to be a hero in those settings. And then this leads to the guarantee tacitly that he will end up in more danger in the future. But Cain is a coward, and a self-admitted coward. He's quite cheerful about it. He wants to survive, and he talks about the difference between him and other commissars. And there's this quote at the bottom here, which is a nice parody of Starship Troopers. So formula-wise, we're still okay. We can identify these beginning, middle, and end, SE to I to DE transitions. We can stretch it a little bit. We can take this formula and say, okay, 40k does have a relatively general formula. And frustratingly, this was articulated far better by a random poster on Reddit. But when I was researching this that I could find, I say frustratingly, it's actually really nice to see other people out there picking this up. But these are sort of very general rules that people may or may not necessarily agree with, but I, having read a fair amount, find them to be relatively true. So the first rule would be that there are no happy endings. Then hope is present in these novels, but hope is futile. The bad situation will always deteriorate. A problem being solved doesn't mean the problem is being solved, and a good moment rarely has a good outcome. So these are these kind of, I hesitate to say rules of the setting, but they are relatively pervasive behind it. Hope is in short supply and usually doomed, but not always. The thing is that if we wanted to look at this in Black Library terms, we are talking about a canon with a large number of items, and 56 of those items are Horus Heresy. But don't worry, there's a flowchart. If you want to read the Horus Heresy books in the exact order that they should be read in, people have made comprehensive flowcharts, and if it's a concern, also don't worry, the first 5 books are in chronological order. The next 51 books, you will need a little bit of interpretation and a flowchart to get through. So, for example, if we were to go back and look at the Horus Heresy as a narrative using this formula, using my framework, then individual stories, yes, formula potentially, but the prospect of 56 books and growing, things are still being published within that particular narrative, as an analytical element for this framework is perhaps a little daunting. So there are disadvantages. The number of texts, as we mentioned, make the broad analysis possible but difficult. You do have this variability of canon. Now, this is a fan statement, but it pops up quite a lot. The idea that everything is canon, but not everything is true. And you do have transmedia storytelling as well, where we see that we are growing out into things like Amazon Prime developing an interest in Warhammer 40k. I would recommend the recent Secret Level episode on this, because it does what I think they will want to do in future, which is arguably to create short form narratives without wider narrative impact, but which encapsulate the setting and what they want from it. So you have this relative inflexibility. So galaxy changing, or world changing in terms of the narrative world, but galaxy changing events are relatively unlikely to occur because of the impact they would have both retroactively and going forward. The commercial context means that any huge narrative changes have to be framed within a sales model based on introducing new products. You do have the historical limitations of the setting. I've kind of hive this off onto the Primarch problem, because you have 20 Primarchs, 2 of which have disappeared, several of which are dead, although that might not stop them. And bringing those back does allow you to create these narrative points, but that's a relatively limited resource, because you can't invent something 20 years ago. You can. Okay, the narrative mechanics of that are possible, but not necessarily fulfilling. In terms of moving forward, retroactivity is interestingly problematic, because modern updates and additions have to reference them and sit comfortably with them, but don't always necessarily have to carry them forward. And you do have this setting limitation in that there is only ever going to be war. So the commercial context became the most fascinating element for this for me in looking at Warhammer 40k using this framework, because Games Workshop is an enormously successful company. And as part of that, they do have a business model that sort of currently works through the processes of repeated updating of product lines and editions, which have been mentioned as we move through 10th towards 11th edition at the moment. We do have updatings of business practices, so the removal of resin models from competitive gameplay, for example, doesn't remove them from the narrative. It makes it less likely that they may appear, because there's that lovely page at the end of most Black Library texts which says, did you enjoy this book? Why not recreate it using the models? And then we do have this tacit phasing out of lines that aren't necessarily doing exactly what is desired. So Chaos Demons in 40k, you can build an army with them. You can't buy a codex. And the Combat Patrol, I believe, is, if not out of print, it's wandering out of print. But you can get a digital index. So you can still play them. You just have to make the extra effort, and it's not necessarily seen as something that they want to have on the shelves in the shops. So a returning Primarch is kind of this key example of this, because Guilliman returns, and so does a model for Guilliman. Narratively, it's a big it's a node within the narrative of 40k when something like this happens, that moving forward from they're present in the setting again, and that can theoretically have an impact on it. But then to go back to Lion, Son of the Forest, my understanding is it was released in 2023 alongside the new model for Lionel Johnson. So we have the return of the Primarch in the narrative setting and the return of the Primarch to tabletop settings as well. So there has to be that reason for a major change to take place or a node to form. You do get these small changes. They do make these small changes in the background. So things like primarisation is a verb that autocorrect refuses to accept. But the Primaris Marines coming in is an updating of a range of models, and it's an opportunity to take models from 10, 15, 20 years ago and bring them into a more modern context. There we go. Not necessarily 100% popular with people who preferred the older range, but potentially popular with people going forward. You get these pragmatic changes, such as the Indomitus Crusade being changed from 12 years, from 112 years in length, because it makes slightly more narrative sense within the setting. You get smaller things like the tweets that come out to say, look, female custodians have always been there. And that's lovely. It's brilliant to see things like this being addressed, because you do have a slightly patriarchal, male-dominated setting, which I'll talk about. Well, no, actually, it's tricky. I'm not going to say setting, but I'm going to say that there is an audience sector that doesn't like change of this type. And you get these tiny changes as well, like in the recent Eldari Codex, where we talk about how Wraithbone is no longer sung into existence by spirit seers and is an ethereal, rare material, but it's actually something that's just made out of it's an ore and conglomerate of several other materials. You do get these outliers as well. So you get, it's not labeled Warhammer Romance, because there isn't a Warhammer Romance label yet, but who knows. But Honorbound is fascinating because it does interact with these ideas that in the grimdark future, humans are still humans. You also get Warhammer Adventures, which fascinates me, because if you've read a Black Library novel, you wouldn't want kids anywhere near it. You wouldn't want children to be present in the narrative, because that is an overwhelming basic threat that no one really wants to see. But Warhammer Adventures is quite cheerful. So on the left, we have the boilerplate, which I'm not going to read in full, but it talks about how in this setting, it's the cruelest and most bloody regime imaginable. To live there is to suffer an eternity of carnage and slaughter. It is to have cries of anguish, and I'm going to fix that spelling mistake, and sorrow. And it's a dark and terrible era. And then you look at the boilerplate for Warhammer Adventures, and the Emperor is no longer a carrion lord or a rotting carcass. He sits on his golden throne. He's ruling it from the golden throne on Terra. And humans have achieved so much, from space travel to robotics. But the universe is a dangerous place, teeming with alien horrors and dark powers. But it's also a place bristling with adventure and wonder, where battles are won and heroes are forged. But yes, it is, to a point. So the commercial context kind of becomes the fulcrum of how to see what the narrative changes do and why they're important. And we can look at the simple question, could the narrative of 40k end? And the answer is yes, because it's been done before. Warhammer Fantasy dropped out of the top 5 non-collectible miniature lines in 2013, but it was then rebooted into Age of Sigmar, which has become much more profitable. And then Warhammer Fantasy has come back as well. Now, a friend tipped me to the Games Workshop press report on their annual report in 2014 after Warhammer Fantasy dropped out of these miniature lines. And this is a quote from that report from Tom Kirby, who is the ex-Games Workshop CEO, who was CEO at the time. He sent an interesting letter at the start of this press report. But the key thing for me was when he says, our market is a niche market made up of people who want to collect our miniatures. They tend to be male, middle class, discerning teenagers and adults. We do no demographic research. We have no focus groups. We do not ask the market what it wants. These things are otiose in a niche. And then Warhammer Fantasy was cancelled. So the second question would be, should the narrative end? And the simple answer is no, because it's consistent top-selling property. It's at the top of these lines and can remain so. It also has this even firmer footing based on its transmedia existence and the way it's transferring its IP into a wider audience share potentially. So could it end? Yes. Should it end? No. Would it end? Not within the narrative setting. Every faction that is present within the setting has to fight every other faction or it will perish. Therefore, that's the whole point about there being only war. There can be only war because there's no negotiation, there's no peace. Speaking as an occasional Tau player, one of the things that's brought up with the Tau, for example, is that I believe they attempted to negotiate with the Tyranids 3 times. And after the 3rd time, they realized that it was possibly not going to go exactly how they want to. But every single faction has its place in the setting that it has to fight to defend. And any intervention by Games Workshop by this would have potentially huge commercial consequences because you only want to discontinue a model line, a faction, if there isn't a defined audience and audience share for it. And that would impact on the narrative. The same friend who tipped me to the report also mentioned the squat problem. So squats disappear early in the 40k setting where they're all eaten by Tyranids and no one is to mention it again, and it becomes a running joke and things become squatted. And then 3 years ago, the Votan are back. Now the squats never went away. They turn up in the Necromantha setting, but they're not coming back as a faction. The Votan come back in their place. So this is kind of where I'm at in terms of the research. The thing is that with a structuralist framework, we have the presumption that problems can be resolved. But with a commercial framework, we don't want to resolve those problems if it's going to lead to something becoming less profitable for a very profitable company, a company whose share value has gone up something like 50% in the last 5 years, which did fantastically well during the lockdown, for example. So this leads to the question of, does this mean we're not going to get narrative satisfaction because we're never going to know how the setting ends, or if they do decide to do so, it would be in a kind of DC Elseworlds format where we see the future, but the present remains, and that also becomes a dilution of IP and a sort of a problematic context. I did find some examples of a consideration of the end of war in Warhammer, and I think the most pertinent one I found was from No Fear. And I'm just going to end my presentation by sharing that to sort of show that it was considered. But as we're aware, it's not happening. Remus Ventanus, captain of the 4th, has command of the Erud province muster. It's supposed to feel like an honour, but doesn't feel like it. It feels like a desk job. It feels like labour for a bureaucrat or administrator. It feels as if the Primarch is teaching him another valuable lesson about the responsibilities of transhumanity. Learn to take pride in the work of governance as well as war, to be a ruler as well as a leader. Remus Ventanus understands this. When the war is done, as it must eventually be done, when there are no more enemies to end and no more worlds to conquer, what will the transhumans who built the Imperium do then? It is the great irony of the Legiones Astartes, Guilliman had told his captains and masters just a week ago, engineered to kill to achieve a victory of peace that they can then be no part of. A conceptual failure, Gage asked. A necessary burden, Sidant suggested. I build your temple, knowing that I will not worship in it. My father had shaken his... Guilliman had shaken his head to both. My father does not make mistakes of that magnitude, he had said. Space Marines excel at warfare because they were designed to excel at everything. Each of you will become a leader, a ruler, the master of your world, and, because there is no more fighting to be done, you will bend your transhuman talents to governance and culture. Remus Ventanus knows that his Primarch believes in this, sincerely. So, just to end, the question I'm looking at is where to go with this next, because it's this thing that this framework, I'm kind of just testing it by basically setting it on things and seeing what happens. And with 40k, you can stick with a microscale. You can look at individual novels or novel lines and run with that. You would get certain elements out of that that would be very fruitful. You can look at genre analysis, and it's fascinating to me, for example, that Warhammer has started to do Warhammer horror very specifically. There's a Warhammer horror line of novels. which is interesting because, frankly, horror is implicit in the setting anyway. So it's kind of horror squared, really. But genre analysis would potentially function. The macro scale, you would be looking more at the rules of the setting as opposed to the full narrative and narrative function of the setting, but it's still possible. The commercial side of things would require market research and economics, and that will be interesting because it will be interesting to see, example, how much sales figures for specifics, specific lines, specific models change as things happen in the Black Library. And I'd have to see if they'd be willing to release those figures, but no harm in asking. My focus tends, however, to be on the morality aspect of narratives like this, because in 40k we tend not to see people get what they deserve, which I'm going to sum up as the all my homies hate Erebus problem. But we tend not to see antagonists necessarily get what they deserve. We tend not to see bad people get what they deserve because the bad people aren't always that easily discernible. I always get stuck on Conrad Kurz with this, who elected to allow himself to be assassinated because death is nothing compared with vindication. So morality would be a way of approaching this and going in there, but it will take quite a bit of leverage and digging. So that's kind of where I'm at. But thank you all for listening. And if anyone has any questions, please do let me know.